This is Professor Ludlum. This is Law of International Business Transactions, LS 4533. Today we're talking about Chapter 13, the regulation of exports. This chapter is somewhat different than everything we've been talking about. Prior to this, everything we've been mentioning is a regulation on imports. These are regulations or barriers that we put in for U.S. companies trying to sell abroad. Now, if you think about it, why would we put a restriction on selling our goods to other countries? Usually it's because of the concepts we'll talk about here, that most of these are defense or weapons related restrictions. But again, it goes much broader than that. One of the big regulations that we deal with is ITAR, International Traffic in Arms Regulation, that regulates everything that has a military use. Now, obviously, it regulates guns and bombs and those kinds of things, but it's much broader than that because it covers everything that has a military application. And you can go look these up on your own. But there's also Export Administration Regulations, EAR. And so ITAR and EAR are the two regulations that deal with anything that has a military use or regulation and all the restrictions we have with selling that abroad. Again, this is a different rationale. In all the other chapters, we're talking about restrictions on goods that are coming to America. This chapter is talking about American-made goods going abroad and our governmental restrictions to not let them sell the goods to other countries. Well, if you remember from constitutional law, we have this Fifth Amendment right that says the government can't take our property without compensating us. And finally, in B West Imports, one of the export companies said, I have produced these goods in America. If you're not going to let me sell them abroad, this is tantamount to the government taking my goods because they're controlling my goods, not letting me do what I wish with them. That amounts to a taking, and the government can't take my goods unless it compensates me. The Supreme Court instead came back and said, no, these aren't a taking. We're just putting in restrictions. You can sell it to any of the countries that we're friendly with, but for security reasons, you cannot sell it to folks that we're not friendly with. And that restriction is not a taking because you still have the goods, you still have the benefit of them. You can sell them to anybody in the United States or any one of our allies. And so it's still not a taking of the goods by the government. Well, this is also a twist of the idea that before we've always been focused on our economy. All the decisions had an economic basis. But now when we're talking about the military, again, if we're just looking at the economy, the best source is always let them sell as much as they can to generate as much profit as they can. But now we have this dilemma between what our economic interests are and what our security interests are. And those sometimes are in exact opposite positions. Again, I know you don't read history, but to give you real-world examples, the plot of Iron Man about Stark Industries and how they were selling military goods abroad and making illegal profits and those kind of things despite government regulations. Or the little older film Eraser with Arnold Schwarzenegger with the Cyrez Corporation talks about government putting restrictions for them selling their magnetic guns and how they were doing it anyway despite the government regulations. This is exactly the type situation that we're talking about here. An American firm produced goods that the government is saying no, they cannot sell them abroad. Now, one of the international agreements that we've done on this is the Wassenaar Agreement. And it creates what we describe as best practices, the easiest ways for countries to regulate the goods that have a military application. The magic word is dual use. Do the goods have a military use as well as a civilian use? Because the producer may look at these goods and say, well, it's obvious we intend them to do a certain civilian use, but it may have a very obvious military application. What do we mean by dual use goods? Again, an easy one is night vision goggles. Again, you don't think of them as being a weapon. They're not a gun. They don't harm anybody, but certainly they have a military application. The same way with lasers, GPS systems. You think about that you use it to find your way back and forth to the mall. The same technology can be used to guide missiles to their target. And so this is our idea of dual use goods. It can have a civilian use, but the fact that it has a military use means we're trying to restrict it or regulate where it goes. The Wassenaar Agreement has these categories. Some of them are fairly obvious about weapons and these type of things, but a lot of them are even broader that you probably never thought of it having a military use. Again, 41 countries are members to the Wassenaar Agreement. A much smaller group than we have with everything else. That gives you a list. Again, not terribly helpful to see the list of names, but probably what's more important is the names that are not on the list. China, especially with its amount of international trade, the fact that they're not on the Wassenaar Agreement to restrict military goods. India, Iran, Iraq, as well as some unfriendly countries to us, are not on the list. And as a result, our restrictions may not be terribly effective when our enemies are not obeying the same regulations. One of the ways that we have to try to make it work to be very effective, and again, remember, we want as much trade as possible. So one of the ways that we allow that is what's validated end-use program. In other words, we verify who the final user of the product is going to be, who you're selling it to, and what they're going to use it for. And then we may validate a specific sale, even though we wouldn't let you generically sell it to anyone else in that country, because we validate who the end user is going to be. The other thing that's confusing about this is deemed exports. In other words, remember, these are things that are not truly sold abroad, but we're going to treat them the same way we treat exports, because it's technology, technical data, all those kinds of software engineering, those kinds of things. Even though you don't sell the good abroad, if you involve foreigners, foreign businesses in the production and work of these goods, we're going to treat them as deemed exports, and so they're subject to the same regulations, even though you have not sold them abroad. When you start thinking about this, the whole idea is to think about our non-economic policies towards trade. And the best example of it is our trade sanctions with Cuba. How has that worked? We've had basically an embargo against Cuba for 5 decades. Has it really changed the attitudes of Cuba? Probably not. The whole focus of the chapter is, again, this trade-off, this problem that you have of how do you protect your domestic economy and make it vibrant at the same time you protect the security when they're at odds with one another. And it's a very difficult process.